So it's time again for another one of our sponsored build videos, and this time around we are working in partnership with ENDORFY for this featured build. ENDORFY is about to launch its first PC case designed in-house entirely from the ground up for the first time. So we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to take a look at the new ARX 700 Air chassis, build an ENDORFY themed system and see just what this new case from ENDORFY is capable of. So the ENDORFY ARX 700 Air is a mid-tower chassis. It supports motherboards up to ATX format. It's a high airflow design. You can see at the front there is a full mesh panel, ultrafine mesh, so it also acts as a dust filter. There's no additional dust filter, which means that obstruction from the front will be reduced. It also comes with 5 140mm fans, the ENDORFY Stratus 140s. Pre-installed, there's 3 at the front, 1 at the top, 1 at the rear. ENDORFY chose 140mm fans because they can offer the same level of airflow as a 120, but at a lower RPM and lower noise as well. So you get 5 fans included in with the price with the ARX 700 Air. It also offers great radiator support, so you can install 2 360mm radiators simultaneously, 1 at the top and 1 at the front. Often that is a problem with mid-tower cases. You can sometimes install 360s in both positions but not simultaneously. With the ARX 700 you can install 2 360mm radiators simultaneously, which is a great feature to have. And it also has a tempered glass side window panel, so you can see all that lovely hardware inside the system. In terms of cooling support, so the case will accept up to 8 fans, so 3 in the roof, 3 at the front, 1 in the rear and 1 on top of the power supply shroud. As I said, you can install radiators up to 360mm in the top and in the front. That also includes 280s, 240s, 120s. There's also space at the back if you remove the fan to install up to a 140mm radiator. Maximum CPU cooler height is at 179mm, so that should be more than enough space for even the biggest air coolers. In terms of hardware support, so motherboards up to ATX form factor can be installed inside the ARX 700 Air. Obviously that also includes micro ATX and mini ATX as well. There's 7 PCIe expansion slots. Maximum graphics card length is 410mm, and because the fans install at the front of the chassis rather than inside the chassis, that means that you can have the fans installed and still have up to a 410mm graphics card. Cable routing space behind the motherboard tray is kind of split into 2 sections, so the motherboard tray has kind of a scoop at the front and you can get up to 30mm of space for cable management there, but then behind the motherboard where the space is shallower, it's up to 20mm of cable routing space, which still sounds really healthy. So there's plenty of space behind the motherboard tray for managing cables. And then in terms of storage support, so you just get one 3.5-inch drive bay. Not so much of a bay, it's just like an installation point underneath the power supply shroud. That also doubles up as a 2.5-inch bay. In total, you can fit up to 6 2.5-inch drives inside the ARX 700. So storage support as well as cooling support and other hardware seems to be really healthy in the ARX 700 Air. So let's take a look around the chassis, see what else there is worth mentioning. First thing to do is remove the tempered glass side panel. So there's just 2 thumb screws which are captive, and then it just slides backwards and the panel lifts out. You can see slight tint on the tempered glass side panel, but it's not too dark, so you should still be able to see inside the system and see all the expensive hardware that you put in there. In terms of I/O connectivity, towards the front of the case you have 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, a single USB Type C port, 3.5mm audio jacks for headphones and microphones, and then power and reset buttons, which is pretty much the standard these days. The front panel's easy to remove as well. Just grab it from the bottom, give it a pull, and you can see there's no additional dust filter behind there. It's just ultrafine mesh, so this acts as a high airflow panel and as a dust filter. And then you can see behind that front panel are the 3 Stratus 140 fans. So as I said, 3 installed at the front, 1 comes at the top and 1 in the rear. And then the top panel is also removable, so it's just another captive thumb screw. Slide the panel backwards and then it just lifts off like that. Again, this is another high airflow ultrafine mesh panel, no additional dust filter in the top, and then there's a 140mm fan installed in the top there, and you can see 1 in the rear, so 5 fans in total. So there's quite a bit going on inside the ARX 700. At the bottom here you have a power supply shroud. It doesn't fully cover the bottom of the case. there's, well, it just stops at the end there, and then there's additional space for radiators. Decent gap there between the power supply shroud and the radiator, so you should be able to fit in quite a thick 360mm radiator at the front, because the 140 or 120mm fans, they kind of install on the outside of the chassis. So this space here between the power supply shroud and the front of the case, that is all for radiators. Up the side here, you can see there's also some cutouts. So these are mounts for pump res combos there. You've also got rubber grommets, big cutouts for cables there, and there's rubber grommets on those. Up at the top, there's more cable cutouts, again with rubber grommets on. Space inside for motherboards, as I said, is up to ATX, so micro ATX and mini ITX fit in there as well. At the front of the case, there is a removable fan bracket, so you have to take out all 6 thumb screws. They're not captive thumb screws, but these screw out pretty easily. So once you've removed all of the 6 screws at the front, you can then just pop the radiator bracket off, bring it down onto your desk or bench or work area, install your fans. You could also install a radiator onto there, and then you just pop it back in position, reinstall the thumb screws, and that makes it a little bit easier to install fans and radiators at the front of the case. And as I say, fans fit on the outside, so it doesn't interfere or doesn't reduce the space inside the case, which is always good. As I've already said, there is space for graphics cards up to 410mm long in the ARX 700 Air. That might reduce slightly if you install a radiator at the front, but still that's loads of room even for the biggest NVIDIA RTX 40 series and AMD RX 7000 series cards. There's also plenty of space for air coolers, so up to 179mm tall air coolers. Again, like I say, that is loads of space, even for the biggest dual tower air coolers. There's a lot going on the power supply shroud on the ARX 700, as you can see. 2 really large cutouts near the bottom of the motherboard. They're bigger than normal. I'm not sure why they're that big, but it will let you have plenty of space for feeding cables through. No rubber grommets on those, they're just open cutouts. There is another cutout at the front of the power supply shroud that is for routing your PCIe cables up to the graphics card. That does have a rubber grommet on it. There's also 2 2.5-inch SSD mounts on top of the power supply shroud, and there's also a 120mm fan mount as well. So you can see at the front of the power supply shroud there's a vent there, so airflow can come directly through, and there's also a large vent on the bottom of the case, so you could potentially install a 120mm fan on the top of the power supply shroud, use that as an intake and some direct airflow to the graphics card, which might be useful. As I say, there's space at the front for 360mm radiators. At the top also you can fit a 360mm radiator up there, or 340mm fans. It's a shame that the case doesn't support 420mm radiators. They're a bit more common these days with, you know, the CPU's been so high power and needing more cooling. It's a shame you can't fit a 420 in the front or the roof, especially when you think that, you know, Endorphy's using 140mm fans, 3 140s, makes a 420 radiator. It's a shame, but probably not a big deal. 360s are still a good size radiator support. On the back panel, you have another 140mm fan, another one of the Endorphy Stratus 140s comes pre-installed there. There's also 7 PCIe slots down the back. There's no vertical mount, and the PCIe slots horizontal are individual slots as well, so they've got bits of metal in between the slots, so it would be difficult if you wanted to buy one of those kind of conversion brackets that Cooler Master do to vertical mount. You'd probably have to chop out some of the case to do that, so it doesn't look like vertical graphics card mounting is really supported in the case. We just flip it round to take a look at the back panel. So fan mount up at the top, 120 or 140 can go in there. There's the rear I/O cutout, 7 PCIe slots, and then at the bottom is the power supply cutout. It's also where you install the power supply from at the bottom, because there's 4 thumb screws that are captive. The bracket comes off for the power supply, you screw that to the power supply, and then install the power supply from the rear and just tighten up the thumb screws to hold it in place. And then the right hand side panel, again, 2 captive thumb screws, slide it backwards and the panel removes. It's just a plain steel side panel. There's no sound dampening material on here, and there's no cutouts for airflow or anything like that. Maybe that could have been a good idea to maybe have a airflow cutout or a vent on this panel to allow some airflow in from the side and maybe up through that power supply fan, but it is a solid steel side panel. And with the right hand side panel off, you can see there's a large cutout on the motherboard tray to get to the back of the motherboard and the CPU cooler backplate. You can also see that it has a contour to this motherboard tray, so it's shallower at this side, about 20mm of cable management space, and then it contours in, which creates more space for cable management. So it looks like this will be a good spot to try and manage most of the cables. There's about 30mm of space here, which is a really healthy amount. 20mm still at this side is good, but that is a good space. Should be able to manage all your cables down there and not have to worry about anything, you know, pressing out the side panel or anything like that. There's more mounting points for 2.5-inch storage as well around here. So you can see there's two on the back of the motherboard tray there. They all install in kind of a toolless design with rubber grommets and screws. They just slide into position. Underneath the power supply shroud, there's another hard drive mount, and that is a combined 3.5 and 2.5-inch mount. You can fit either 3.5 or 2.5-inch drives in there, just one of each. You can also see there's a fan controller on here as well. So this is just a basic PWM fan controller. It will accept 5 fans, which are fully populated with the 5 that come with the case, and then it connects to the motherboard using a standard 4-pin PWM header. There's also plenty of space for installing the power supply down there. It's almost unlimited. I can't think of any power supply that won't fit in there. There's loads of space for a big power supply and cable management. Maybe installing a 3.5-inch drive there might, you know, reduce the access slightly to cables, but even with a hard drive installed down there, you've got loads of room for a big power supply and for managing cables. So that looks like a nice healthy space. There's also some foam feet there for the power supply to sit on to reduce vibrations. If you just flip the case over, you can see at the bottom of the case there are 4 feet, and they have some kind of anti-vibration foam on there as well. I'd say they probably raise the case up about 25mm from the ground. And there's also a dust filter in here which is removable. It kind of slots into these rails, but it is also magnetic as well. And then you can see when that dust filter is removed, you've got a large open vent on the power supply shroud or on the floor of the case to allow air to come in through the power supply shroud, and again, like I say, up through that 120mm fan and directed straight to the graphics card. So it does look like quite an open chassis. There's vents from front, top and the bottom of the case, so it should be pretty good at keeping high-end systems nice and cool. Okay, so let's get on with building a system inside this case then. The parts for the build are all in front of me on the desk. It's an Intel NVIDIA build, this one, and the CPU is an Intel Core i9-13900KS Special Edition CPU, so don't be surprised if we do see some pretty high temperatures. In excess of 90 degrees on this CPU is normal, as far as normal goes. I'll also be using a contact frame for this as well, so I'll be removing the stock ILM from the motherboard using a contact frame. Motherboard for the build is this Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Master. Brilliant motherboard, that used that before a few times. Memory, I'm going to be using 32 gigabytes of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB DDR5. This is a 2x16 gigabyte kit and 6,000 mega transfers per second. For storage, just a single M.2 drive. I'm going to be using the Corsair MP600 PCIe Gen 4. It's a 1 terabyte M.2 NVMe drive. And for graphics, it's the Inno3D iChill X3, so RTX 4080. Pretty decent sized card, so it is a high-end system. Obviously, we're going to be pushing this case to the limits. Endorphy boast about it can, you know, support all high-end hardware, so we're going to stick a big high-end system inside it. And to kind of give it a bit of a Endorphy theme, the power supply and the CPU cooler are Endorphy products. So the power supply is this Endorphy Supremo FM5. It's a 1 kilowatt power supply, 80 plus gold rated, fully modular, and then the CPU cooler will be the Endorphy Navis F360, so 360mm, 320mm fans on this CPU cooler. I'll probably install that in the roof of the case. I will have to remove one of the 140mm fans, and I also might try and find a 120mm fan matching the system theme to install on top of the power supply shroud to give the graphics card a bit of direct airflow and see how that works. So let's get on with this build and see what we can do with the ARX 700 Air. Okay, so the build's complete, system's up and running. You can see I'm running the 3D Mark Timespy Extreme stress test just to see that everything's working as it should be. It's a good case to build a system with. I didn't have much or really anything to complain about. The only thing I needed to do really was remove one of these 140mm fans so that I could get the 360mm AIO up at the top. And that is pretty much it, really. It just works. Everything is where you'd expect it to be. Alignment of things like the motherboard standoffs, the rear I/O cutout, PCIe slots, all lined up well. In terms of build quality, it's pretty good for a budget stroke mid-range case. When you remove this top panel, the chassis panel below that is slightly weak and a bit flimsy, but other than that, I can't really complain with the build quality either. Only a couple of other things I did was added a 120mm fan on the power supply shroud. So that's a Noctua Chromax black fan, and that's kind of acting as an intake, blowing some cool air directly onto the graphics card. We'll see how that helps with temperatures in a minute. I'm going to do some thermal testing soon. The only other thing I did was swap one of the cables for the power supply. That's no detriment to the case at all. It's basically because the 12 volt high power connection on the graphics card needs a special cable. The solution that comes from NVIDIA with that short cable is not very good. So what I ended up doing was finding one from a Seasonic power supply, modifying it slightly and making it work with the ENDORFY power supply, and I think it looks better. It's not perfect, a custom cable would look brilliant, but it definitely looks better than that NVIDIA solution, that short cable. Really not a fan of those at all. But other than that, it's a good case to build a system with. It brought up no surprises like some cheap cases might do. You may run into some issues. I just dropped the rear fan slightly to get the radiator in at the top, but other than that, it was a really straightforward build and everything has worked out well, and it looks good as well. It's the finished build looks good. I kind of stuck with the theme of the ARX 700 Air, which is like a stealthy all black design. I've added a little hint of RGB lighting with the memory and the RGB on the motherboard and things like that, but it's a nice looking system. It's finished looking as good as I'd hoped, and I think it matches the design of the case. You really can't argue with this case, I don't think, for €109 with 5 fans. Maybe if you're using AIO, you don't need 5 fans, but if you're using an air cooler, that 5th fan will come in handy. So I can't really complain about anything with this case. It seems like really good value for money. I'd say maybe the only thing with it, if I'm being really picky, is that ENDORFY may have been slightly conservative with the aesthetics on the outside, but it is stealthy, it is quite understated, and it probably will fit in with virtually any kind of theme or any scenario, whether it's gaming PC, an office PC, or anything really. So it's a good case, good value for money, and I think ENDORFY's done a good job. One thing I did forget to mention earlier on in the video when I was looking around the case is the front panel. It actually is in 2 pieces. You can just pull the mesh off and clean the dust filter out separately, just held in place magnetically. It just slots in at the bottom and then holds in magnetically, so that's a decent little feature as well. So I put the tempered glass side panel back on. The system is running the 3D Mark Timespy Extreme stress test and the Cinebench R23 stress test in a loop simultaneously. It's been going for about 20 minutes now. Just have a quick look at the thermals. So the CPU, as you can see, is running at 95 degrees, which isn't anything out of the ordinary for this 13900 case. We'll ignore that because it doesn't really make much difference what cooler you use on this or what case you're using. It just runs hot, whatever. The package power is about 300 watts, so that's running in the 90s. We're going to concentrate on the GPU temperature. And if you look at the graph, you can see GPU temperatures running about 60 degrees with the 3D Mark Timespy Extreme stress test running, which sounds really good. I'm really impressed with that actually. Those 340mm fans at the front, and maybe that fan on the power supply shroud is giving a lot of airflow to the graphics card and keeping it nice and cool. So this case looks like a good one for high-end gaming systems. This is RTX 4080 in here, keeping that at 60 degrees. It's not really budging. It seems to have flatlined or plateaued at around about 60 to 61 degrees. So thermal performance as well in the ARX 700 Air seems really good. If you're using a lesser powered CPU, you're going to get better than 95 degrees on the CPU. It is stable at 95, so it's not throttling the 13900 case. So overall it looks like a really good case. It seems like good value for money, especially coming with 5 fans. The aesthetics are okay, there's nothing offensive about how it looks. It'll fit in more or less any scenario, and the thermal performance speaks for itself. GPU temperatures are excellent in the ARX 700, so it's definitely one that I'll think about using in the future. If you're building a system anytime soon, look out for this. It should be available this month, priced at €109, so it's in that kind of budget stroke mid-range category. So overall, really good case, the ARX 700 Air. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed watching the build in the ENDORFY ARX 700 Air. If you have, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. If you enjoy what we do here at Kit Guru and you want to help support us, you can head over to our store and pick up some merch, or you could even subscribe to our Patreon. And as always, if you want to catch up on all the in-depth technical reviews, head over to our website.